punishment throughout history has been, well, pretty awful. We're talking about the kind of things that make stubbing your toe or getting a paper cut seem like a day at the spa. Our ancestors came up with some truly nasty ways to punish people who stepped out of line, or sometimes just because they felt like it. So buckle up, but not too tight, because this is gonna get rough. As we take a look at some of the worst punishments ever devised, prepare for cringing, wincing, and maybe even a few laughs, because, hey, if we don't laugh, we might just cry. Blood Eagle. The Blood Eagle sounds like something out of a horror movie. But nope, it was a real thing, and it wasn't pretty. Imagine a Viking warrior standing over his enemy, who's tied up and probably regretting every life choice that led him to this moment. The Viking then takes a sharp knife and cuts open the poor guy's back, hacking through ribs and flesh like he's chopping wood. But wait, it gets worse. The Viking then pulls the lungs out through the back and drapes them over the shoulders like a grotesque set of wings. Voila, you got yourself a Blood Eagle. Now you might be thinking, wow, those Vikings really knew how to hold a grudge. And you'd be right. The Blood Eagle wasn't just about killing someone, it was about sending a message. Don't mess with us, or you'll get a one-way ticket to Eagle City. And by Eagle City, I mean a really painful, probably very short trip to the afterlife. On the bright side, it's not something you'd see in your day-to-day life anymore, unless your neighbors are really, really into ancient Viking rituals, in which case you might want to move. Keelhauling. Keelhauling sounds like an exciting water sport, right? Wrong! Unless, of course, your idea of fun involves getting dragged under a ship's barnacle-encrusted hull. If you think scraping your knee on concrete is bad, try getting scraped against the bottom of a wooden ship covered in sharp shells and other delightful oceanic growths. Oh, and let's not forget the delightful prospect of drowning, because you're tied up and being pulled underwater the entire time. The process of keel hauling was a favorite among sailors who needed to punish one of their own. The poor soul would be tied with ropes and then thrown overboard, dragged under the ship from one side to the other, and pulled up on the opposite side, assuming he made it that far. This punishment was less about teaching someone a lesson and more about making sure everyone else on board knew that screwing up wasn't an option, unless they were really into pain and/or had a weird fondness for barnacles. In a way, keel hauling was the ultimate clean up your act experience. One moment you're a regular sailor with a bad attitude, and the next you're taking the worst undersea tour of your life. But hey, at least you didn't have to pay for the ride. Impalement. The pointy end goes in, but it doesn't come out. Impalement is one of those punishments that really makes you appreciate modern life, where the most you might have to worry about is a parking ticket. Back in the day though, if you were unlucky enough to be sentenced to impalement, you were in for a world of hurt. The process involved a large, sharp stake. Think of it as a medieval shish kebab, only you're the kebab. The victim would be forced onto the stake, which would then be driven through the body. If you were really unlucky, and if you were being impaled, you were already pretty unlucky. The stake would miss vital organs, and it takes its sweet time coming out the other end. This could take hours or even days, depending on the angle and how sadistic your impaler was feeling that day. And who could forget the most famous fan of impalement? Vlad the Impaler, the man who inspired Dracula. Vlad didn't just use impalement as punishment. He used it as a form of artistic expression, decorating his land with impaled enemies like some kind of ghastly garden gnome display. If you visited Vlad's turf, you'd quickly learn that the stakes were high, literally. So next time you think about complaining that your coffee is too hot, just remember, at least you're not being turned into a human popsicle. Rats. Rats aren't exactly known for being cuddly, and in history, they were used as a punishment that makes a bad hair day seem like a gift. This one's as gross as it gets, so if you're eating, you might want to finish up before reading on. The concept was simple but horrifying. The victim would be tied down and a cage of hungry rats would be placed on their stomach or chest. Then the torturer would heat up the cage, causing the rats to panic. And where do panicked rats go when they're trying to escape? They start burrowing into the nearest soft, squishy thing they can find. Yep, that's the poor sap tied to the table. As you can imagine, this wasn't exactly a quick way to go. The rats would dig and chew their way through flesh and organs, all while the victim was fully conscious. It was a slow, agonizing death, not to mention one that would make anyone who witnessed it never want to go near a pet store again. In terms of creativity, you've got to hand it to the people who came up with this one. They really found a way to make a bad situation even worse. But in terms of actual punishment, well, let's just say it's a pretty solid argument against having any kind of rat infestation, ever. Scaphism. Scaphism, also known as the boats, is the kind of punishment that sounds like it was thought up by someone who really hated the idea of dying quickly. It was a Persian method of torture that combined the worst aspects of drowning, starvation, and bug bites into one awful package. Here's how it worked. The victim was placed in between two boats or hollowed out logs, with only their head, hands, and feet sticking out. Then they were force-fed milk and honey until they were, well, a little more than full. This mixture would eventually lead to severe diarrhea, because the ancient Persians were clearly all about making things as gross as possible. But the fun didn't stop there. The victim would be left floating in a stagnant pond or swamp covered in more honey, which would attract all sorts of insects. Bugs would then feast on the honey, but eventually they'd start to feast on the person as well. Meanwhile, the milk and the honey diet would continue causing the body to fester and rot from the inside out. The victim would slowly die over the course of days, sometimes even weeks, all while being eaten alive by bugs and slowly decomposing. It's the kind of punishment that makes you grateful for modern justice systems, where the worst thing you might face is a fine or some community service. So, if you ever think you're having a bad day, just remember, at least you're not floating in a swamp covered in honey while bugs eat you alive. Silver linings, right? The rack. The rack is one of the most iconic torture devices in history, and not in a good way. If you've ever had a bad back and wished someone could just pull you apart to make it feel better, this is one invention that proves you should be careful what you wish for. The rack was essentially a long wooden table with rollers on each end. The victim would be strapped down by their wrists and ankles, and then the rollers would start turning. Slowly but surely, the person's body would be stretched out like a piece of dough, only this dough didn't want to be stretched at all. As the rollers turned, the person's joints would start to pop out of their sockets. The pain was excruciating, and if the torturer was feeling particularly nasty, they'd keep going until the limbs were completely dislocated. In some cases, the torturers would go even further, stretching the person until their muscles and ligaments tore, or even until their limbs were pulled off entirely. The rack wasn't about causing pain, it was about breaking a person's spirit. The idea was that the victim would be so desperate to make the pain stop, they'd confess to anything, even things they didn't do. And let's be honest, if someone was stretching you like a human rubber band, you'd probably confess to stealing cookies from the cookie jar when you were 5, even if you didn't do it. Today, the rack is thankfully a thing of the past, and the closest most of us get to being stretched is during a yoga class. But it's a good reminder that sometimes it's better to keep your problems to yourself, especially if you're living in the Middle Ages. Conclusion. So there you have it, a rundown of some of the worst punishments in human history. Sure, we might have to deal with annoying coworkers, traffic jams, or bills, but at least we're not getting turned into human bird sculptures, dragged under ships, or fed to rats. Looking back at these brutal methods really make us appreciate how far we've come. Today, punishments are fines, jail time, or maybe a boring lecture. Those are nothing compared to the nightmarish creativity of ancient punishments designed to terrify people into obedience. So next time you're having a rough day, just remember that it could be worse. You're not stuck in a swamp covered in honey or being stretched on the rack.